long before the cathedrals rose toward heaven, before monks copied manuscripts by candlelight in cold stone monasteries, before the first universities opened their doors to eager students of the cosmos, there existed a body of knowledge so ancient and so profound that it seemed to hold the very secrets of fate itself. This knowledge had traveled across centuries and civilizations, passing from the stargazers of Babylon to the philosophers of Alexandria, accumulating wisdom like sediment settling at the bottom of a great river. By the time it reached the threshold of what we now call the medieval world, it had become something extraordinary. It's a complete system for understanding the relationship between the movements of celestial bodies and the unfolding of human destiny. The story of medieval astrology does not begin in the medieval period at all. It begins in the sun-baked lands of Mesopotamia, where priests watched the heavens with patient devotion, recording the risings and settings of planets, the phases of the moon, and the mysterious wanderings of those bright points of light that seemed to move against the fixed tapestry of stars. These early observers believed that the gods communicated through celestial signs, that the heavens were a great tablet upon which divine intentions were inscribed for those who possessed the wisdom to read them. Over thousands of years, their observations accumulated into vast archives of celestial omens, connecting specific planetary configurations with earthly events such as floods, famines, the deaths of kings, and the outcomes of wars. When Alexander the Great carried Greek culture eastward in the 4th century before the Common Era, two great traditions of celestial observation collided and merged. The Babylonian expertise in planetary calculation met the Greek genius for systematic philosophy, and from this marriage emerged Hellenistic astrology, the direct ancestor of the astrological traditions that would dominate the medieval world. The great cosmopolitan city of Alexandria, where the famous library held the accumulated wisdom of the ancient world. Scholars began to synthesize these traditions into something new. They developed the concept of the horoscope, a map of the heavens at the moment of birth that could reveal the native's character, fortune, and fate. They elaborated the meanings of the 12 zodiacal signs, the 7 traditional planets, and the 12 houses of heaven. They created a symbolic language of cosmic influence that would endure for nearly 2 millennia. Among the most influential of these Hellenistic astrologers was Claudius Ptolemy, who lived in Alexandria during the 2nd century of the Common Era. Ptolemy was not merely an astrologer, but a polymath of extraordinary range, contributing fundamental works to astronomy, geography, optics, and music theory. His astrological treatise, known as the Tetrabiblos, or 4 books, would become the single most authoritative text on celestial science throughout the medieval period. In this work, Ptolemy attempted to place astrology on a rational, naturalistic foundation, arguing that the celestial bodies influenced the earth through physical emanations rather than through the direct intervention of gods or spirits. The sun, he observed, clearly affected earthly life through its heat and light, causing the seasons to change and crops to grow. The moon governed the tides and seemed to affect the moisture in all things. Was it not reasonable, then, to suppose that the more distant planets also exerted their influences, however subtle, upon the sublunary realm? Ptolemy's approach gave astrology an intellectual respectability that would prove crucial to its survival and transmission. By framing celestial influence in terms of natural philosophy rather than religious revelation, he made it possible for astrology to be studied as a science, subject to reason and observation rather than mere tradition and faith. The Tetrabiblos provided a systematic account of planetary natures, describing Saturn as cold and dry, bringing melancholy and constraint, while Jupiter was warm and moist, bestowing growth and good fortune. Mars was hot and dry, associated with conflict and courage, while Venus was warm and moist, governing love and pleasure. Mercury was variable, taking on the nature of whatever planet it associated with, while the sun and moon presided over vitality and the rhythms of bodily life. These planetary characters, established in Hellenistic times, would remain essentially unchanged throughout the medieval period and beyond. Yet Ptolemy was only one voice among many in the rich chorus of Hellenistic astrology. Dorotheus of Sidon, who may have lived in the 1st century of the Common Era, composed an influential work in verse that emphasized the practical techniques of astrological prediction. His poem, originally written in Greek, but surviving primarily through Arabic translation, dealt extensively with the timing of events, teaching astrologers how to determine when the promises of a birth chart would manifest in the native's life. Vettius Valens, writing in the 2nd century, left behind a massive anthology of astrological techniques and example charts, providing invaluable insight into how ancient astrologers actually practiced their craft. These texts, along with many others now lost or fragmentary, formed the inheritance that would pass to later ages. The transmission of this inheritance was neither simple nor guaranteed. As the Roman Empire declined and eventually fell in the West, much of the sophisticated intellectual culture of antiquity was lost or forgotten. Libraries were destroyed, schools closed, and the complex technical traditions of Hellenistic astrology largely disappeared from Western Europe. The Latin West retained only fragments of the great astrological tradition, primarily through encyclopedic summaries and the works of late Roman authors who had only partial understanding of the technical details. For centuries, Western Europeans would possess only the shadow of astrological knowledge. Aware that the ancients had read the stars with great sophistication, but lacking the texts and training to do so themselves. In the Eastern Mediterranean, however, the situation was different. The Kina Byzantine Empire, heir to the Eastern Roman tradition, preserved Greek learning with remarkable fidelity. In Constantinople, the works of Ptolemy and other ancient authorities remained available in their original language, studied by scholars who maintained an unbroken connection to classical culture. Byzantine astrology never achieved the prominence it would later attain in the Islamic world or in medieval Western Europe, partly due to recurring ecclesiastical suspicion. But the texts survived, copied and recopied by generations of scribes. This Byzantine preservation would later prove crucial when Western scholars sought to recover the astrological wisdom of antiquity. More immediately significant for the history of medieval astrology was the transmission that occurred eastward into the Persian world. When the Sasanian Empire arose in Persia in the 3rd century, it became heir to multiple astrological traditions. Persian scholars had access to Babylonian celestial lore through centuries of cultural contact, and they eagerly absorbed Greek astrological texts translated from Alexandria. They also maintained connections with India, where a distinctive astrological tradition had developed, incorporating concepts such as the lunar nodes and elaborate systems of planetary periods. In the great Sasanian academies, these diverse traditions mingled and merged, producing a sophisticated synthesis that would later pass to the Islamic world. The Sasanian contribution to astrological history is often overlooked, yet it was essential. Persian astrologers developed and refined many techniques that would become standard in medieval practice. They placed particular emphasis on mundane astrology, the branch of the art concerned with predicting events affecting kingdoms, nations, and the world at large. The theory of great conjunctions, which held that the regular meetings of Saturn and Jupiter in the heavens marked turning points in human history, received particular elaboration in Persian hands. These conjunctions occurred approximately every 20 years, and over time they shifted through the zodiacal signs in a predictable pattern. Persian astrologers developed an elaborate periodization of history based on these cycles, linking celestial patterns to the rise and fall of dynasties and religions. This rich tradition of Persian astrology would soon find new expression in a transformed world. In the 7th century, Arab armies swept out of the Arabian Peninsula with astonishing speed, conquering the Sasanian Empire entirely and taking vast territories from Byzantium. Within a century, a new civilization had arisen, stretching from Spain to Central Asia, united by the Arabic language and the faith of Islam. This civilization would become the crucible in which the astrological traditions of antiquity were preserved, refined, and eventually transmitted to medieval Europe. The stars that had guided Babylonian priests and Greek philosophers would soon shine over the minarets of Baghdad. And from there, their light would eventually reach the cathedral schools of Christendom. The cosmological worldview that underlay ancient and medieval astrology was fundamentally different from the understanding of the universe that prevails today. The earth stood at the center of creation, surrounded by a series of crystalline spheres that carried the celestial bodies in their courses. The sphere of the moon marked a crucial boundary, separating the changeable sublunary realm from the perfect and eternal heavens above. Below the moon, the four elements of earth, water, air, and fire mixed and mingled, constantly transforming into one another. Subject to generation and corruption, above the moon, the celestial bodies moved in perfect circles, composed of a fifth element, the quintessence, which knew neither change nor decay. In this cosmic architecture, influence flowed downward from the heavens to the earth. The celestial bodies, by their motions and configurations, shaped the elemental mixtures of the sublunary world, affecting weather, crops, animals, and human beings. This influence was not mechanical in the modern sense, but operated through qualities and correspondences. Saturn, the most distant of the visible planets, was cold and dry because its remoteness from the sun denied it warmth, and its slow motion suggested the stiffness of old age. These same qualities of coldness and dryness characterize certain earthly substances, certain temperaments, certain diseases, and certain fates. Through this elaborate web of correspondences, the cosmos was revealed as a unified whole, every part reflecting and resonating with every other. This was the inheritance that awaited transmission to the medieval world. It was a complete system for understanding human existence within the cosmic order, a framework that promised knowledge of the future, explanation of the past, and guidance for action in the present. It offered a comfort in the face of life's uncertainties, suggesting that suffering had meaning within a larger celestial pattern, and it offered hope that wise attention to the heavens might help mortals navigate the challenges of earthly existence. Whether this system was true in any objective sense mattered less than its power to organize, experience, and provide a coherent worldview for the people of the medieval age who lived in a world full of dangers and uncertainties, who faced plague and famine and war without the protections of modern medicine or technology. The astrology they inherited from antiquity would prove an irresistible intellectual and spiritual resource. The stars seem to promise what every human heart desires, a sense that our lives unfold according to a meaningful pattern, that we are not abandoned in a cold and random universe, but held within the embrace of a cosmos that knows our names and marks our days. As the late antique world gave way to the early medieval period, the transmission of this celestial wisdom hung in the balance. In the Latin West, learning contracted and simplified, and the sophisticated techniques of Hellenistic astrology faded from memory. In Byzantium, the texts survive, but remained somewhat marginal to the dominant concerns of Orthodox Christian culture. It would be in the Islamic world, in the courts of caliphs, and the circles of scholars who gathered in the great cities of the new empire, that the ancient star lore would find its most enthusiastic reception and its most creative development. The next chapter of this story would be written not in Greek or Latin, but in Arabic, and it would unfold beneath the domes and in the libraries of a civilization that saw no contradiction between faith in one God and attention to the movements of his celestial servants. In the year 762, along the western bank of the Tigris River, the Abbasid Caliph Al-Mansur founded a new capital city that would become the intellectual center of the world. Baghdad rose from the Mesopotamian plain in a perfect circle, its round walls enclosing palaces, mosques, and markets, its gates opening toward the four cardinal directions, as if the city itself were a great horoscope cast upon the earth. Legend held that Al-Mansur consulted astrologers before laying the first brick, choosing a moment when Jupiter was rising so that no caliph would ever be killed within its walls. Whether or not this story is true, it captures something essential about the civilization that will flourish in this city. Here, in the heart of the Islamic world, astrology would not merely survive, but thrive, reaching heights of sophistication that surpassed even the achievements of Hellenistic Alexandria. The Abbasid caliphs, who ruled from Baghdad, presided over a vast empire that stretched from the borders of China to the shores of the Atlantic. This empire was heir to multiple ancient civilizations, and its rulers proved remarkably eager to claim this inheritance. Under their patronage, a great translation movement began, one of the most consequential intellectual enterprises in human history. Scholars were commissioned to translate the philosophical, scientific, and medical works of the Greeks into Arabic, making the accumulated wisdom of antiquity available to a new civilization. The so-called House of Wisdom, a library and research institution founded by the Caliph al-Ma'mun in the early 9th century, became the center of this effort, though translation activity had begun decades earlier and occurred in many other locations as well. Astrological texts were among the very first to be translated. The reasons for this priority were both practical and theoretical. On the practical level, astrology offered knowledge that rulers desperately wanted. It's the ability to predict the future, to choose auspicious moments for important actions, to understand the celestial forces shaping political events. These were capabilities of obvious value to caliphs seeking to maintain and extend their power. On the theoretical level, astrology was intimately connected to astronomy, and astronomy was necessary for the practical requirements of Islamic religious life. Muslims needed to determine the times of the 5 daily prayers, the direction of Mecca for worship, and the beginning and end of the lunar month of Ramadan. The mathematical and observational techniques required for these religious purposes were the same techniques used in casting horoscopes. And so, the two enterprises developed hand in hand. Among the earliest and most influential of the Arabic astrologers was Mashallah ibn Athari, a Jewish scholar who lived in the late 8th and early 9th centuries. Mashallah participated in the selection of the auspicious moment for the founding of Baghdad, and he went on to produce a substantial body of astrological writings that would be translated into Latin and studied in medieval Europe for centuries. His works covered a wide range of topics, from nativities to mundane astrology. But he was particularly renowned for his treatment of interrogations. It's a branch of astrology that answers specific questions based on charts cast for the moment the question is asked. Mashallah's practical, technique-focused approach set the tone for much of Arabic astrological writing, which tended to emphasize method and application over philosophical speculation. Sahl ibn Bishr, who flourished in the early 9th century, is another foundational figure whose works shaped the development of both Arabic and later European astrology. Sahl served as an astrologer at the Abbasid court and produced influential treatises on nativities, elections, and interrogations. His writing was characterized by clarity and systematic organization, presenting astrological techniques in a form that could be readily learned and applied. Sahl drew upon the Hellenistic tradition, particularly the work of Dorotheus of Sidon, but he also incorporated Persian and Indian elements, creating a synthesis that was distinctively Islamic in character. His works would later be translated into Latin by Jewish scholars in medieval Spain, becoming standard textbooks in European astrological education. The greatest of all the Arabic astrologers, the figure whose influence would dominate medieval astrological thought, was Abu Mashar al-Baqi, known in the Latin West as Abu Masar. Born in the city of Balkh in present-day Afghanistan around the year 787, Abu Mashar came to Baghdad as a young man and initially devoted himself to the study of hadith, the traditions concerning the words and deeds of the Prophet Muhammad. A dispute with the philosopher Al-Kindi led him to study philosophy and mathematics, and from there he turned to astrology, which he would practice and teach for the rest of his long life. Abu Mashar died in 886, Having lived nearly a century and having produced a body of work that would shape astrological thinking for generations to come, Abu Mashar's great achievement was to provide astrology with a comprehensive philosophical foundation, demonstrating its compatibility with Aristotelian natural philosophy and thereby securing its place among the legitimate sciences. Its most important work, the Great Introduction to Astrology, was not primarily a technical manual, but a theoretical treatise explaining why celestial bodies influence earthly events and how this influence should be understood within a broader cosmological framework. Drawing upon the Aristotelian concept of causation, Abu Mashar argued that the celestial spheres, through their motions, transmitted the creative power of the unmoved mover to the sublunary realm. The planets were not themselves the ultimate causes of earthly events, but rather instruments through which divine providence operated, signs that indicated the unfolding of a cosmic plan rather than arbitrary determiners of fate. This philosophical sophistication had profound implications for the relationship between astrology and religion. By presenting celestial influence as part of the natural order established by God, Abu Mashar made it possible to practice astrology without challenging monotheistic faith. The stars did not compel human actions, but rather indicated tendencies and probabilities that the wise could understand and respond to. Free will remained intact, for the heavens inclined but did not necessitate. This formulation, which had roots in Ptolemy's naturalistic approach, would become the standard defense of astrology against religious critics throughout the medieval period, both in the Islamic world and in Christian Europe. Abu Mashar also made crucial contributions to mundane astrology. The application of celestial science to the fates of nations, religions, and the world at large. Building upon Persian theories, he elaborated an extensive system based on the conjunctions of Saturn and Jupiter. These two outermost planets met in the heavens approximately every 20 years, and their conjunctions occurred in signs of the same element, fire, earth, air, or water, for roughly 200 years before shifting to signs of a different element. Abu Mashar correlated these great cycles with major transformations in human history, arguing that changes in the elemental triplicity of the Saturn-Jupiter conjunctions coincided with the rise of new religions and the fall of empires. This theory provided a framework for understanding history as a cosmic process, governed by celestial rhythms that the astrologer could calculate and interpret. The conjunction theory had obvious appeal for rulers seeking to understand their place in the sweep of time. It also raised provocative questions, for if the rise of religions could be predicted from the stars, did this not imply that Islam itself was merely one phase in a cosmic cycle, destined eventually to be superseded? Some Islamic scholars found this implication deeply troubling, and Abu Mashar's theories would later attract criticism on religious grounds. Yet, the prestige of astrology at the Abbasid court was sufficient to protect such speculations, at least during the high point of the translation movement. Caliphs continued to consult astrologers, and astrological texts continued to be produced and studied. The Arabic astrological tradition was not merely a passive recipient of Greek and Persian learning, but an active creator of new knowledge and techniques. Arabic astrologers refined the mathematical methods used to calculate planetary positions, developing more accurate tables and more efficient computational procedures. They elaborated the system of lots or Arabic parts, calculated points derived from the positions of planets and house cusps that were believed to indicate specific areas of life, such as fortune, marriage, or death. They developed new techniques for the interpretation of interrogations, the astrological method that answers questions based on the moment they are asked. They created elaborate systems of planetary dignities and debilities, specifying the conditions under which a planet was strong or weak, well-placed or ill-placed in a horoscope. The Arabic astrologers also developed a distinctive vocabulary and set of concepts that would pass into Latin and eventually into the modern astrological tradition. Terms such as almutin, referring to the planet with the most dignities at a particular degree, and Hylek, designating the giver of life in a nativity, entered the technical language of astrology through Arabic mediation. The concept of the planetary joy, in which each planet was believed to rejoice in a particular house of the horoscope, received systematic elaboration in Arabic texts. The intricate rules for determining which planet was the lord of a geniture, the overall ruler of a birth chart, were codified and refined by Arabic authorities. In all these ways, the Arabic tradition added layers of complexity and precision to the astrological inheritance from antiquity. The transmission of Indian astrological concepts into the Arabic tradition represented another significant development. Through trade and cultural contact, Arabic scholars became aware of Indian astronomical and astrological methods, some of which differed substantially from the Hellenistic approaches they had inherited from Greek sources. The most important Indian contribution was perhaps the system of nakshatras, the 27 or 28 lunar mansions that divided the zodiac according to the moon's daily motion. Arabic astrologers adapted this system, creating the manazil, al-qamar, or mansions of the moon, which assigned specific meanings and appropriate activities to each lunar position. This system would later pass into Latin astrology and find wide application in the medieval West, particularly in magical and talismanic contexts. Indian influence was also felt in the realm of planetary periods, systems for dividing a life into segments governed by different planets in sequence. The Arabic astrologers developed their own version of these period systems, known as zodiac, which assigned years of life to each planet, in turn according to a fixed scheme. Unlike the Indian systems, which based the initial period on the moon's position at birth, the Arabic zodiac followed a fixed sequence regardless of the birth chart. These periods were believed to color the general tenor of life during their duration, with years ruled by benefic planets tending toward good fortune, and those ruled by malefics inclining toward difficulty and struggle. The institutional context of Arabic astrology differed markedly from what had prevailed in the ancient world. While Hellenistic astrologers had often worked as independent practitioners serving private clients, the most prominent Arabic astrologers typically held positions at royal courts, serving caliphs, emirs, and viziers. This patronage system had important consequences for the development of astrological practice. Court astrologers were expected to provide advice on matters of state, choosing auspicious times for military campaigns, diplomatic initiatives, and public ceremonies. They were called upon to interpret celestial signs that might portend dangers to the realm or opportunities for expansion. They participated in the great intellectual projects of the Abbasid age, collaborating with astronomers, mathematicians, and philosophers in an atmosphere of remarkable scholarly exchange. The position of court astrologer was both prestigious and precarious. Success in prediction brought honors and rewards, but failure could mean disgrace or worse. The Arabic historical sources record numerous stories of astrologers who rose to great influence through accurate forecasts, and others who fell from favor when their predictions proved wrong. Some astrologers became trusted confidants of rulers, shaping policy through their interpretations of celestial signs. Others found themselves caught in political intrigues, their predictions used to justify actions that had already been decided upon or to undermine rivals at court. The astrologer's role was thus not merely technical, but deeply political, requiring skill in human affairs as much as knowledge of the heavens. Astrology permeated Arabic intellectual culture more broadly. The study of the stars was considered part of a complete education, and many scholars who were not primarily astrologers nonetheless possessed substantial astrological knowledge. Physicians used astrology to diagnose diseases and determine the best times for treatment. Alchemists correlated their operations with planetary hours and sought celestial favor for their transformative work. Architects and builders consulted the stars when laying foundations for important structures. Even the critics of astrology, and there were critics within Islamic intellectual culture, typically knew the subject well enough to mount sophisticated objections against it. The golden age of Arabic astrology coincided with the golden age of Islamic civilization more broadly. The period from roughly the 8th through the 11th centuries, when Baghdad and other great cities of the Islamic world were unrivaled centers of learning and culture. During this time, the foundations were laid for the transmission of astrology to medieval Europe. The Arabic texts that would later be translated into Latin were composed. The techniques and concepts that would shape European astrological practice were developed, and the philosophical frameworks that would justify astrology to Christian theologians were articulated. Without the creative synthesis achieved by the Arabic astrologers, the rich astrological culture of the medieval West would have been impossible. As the centuries passed, the political unity of the Islamic world, fragmented in Baghdad's preeminence, gave way to a more dispersed pattern of cultural centers. Yet, astrology continued to flourish throughout the Islamic lands, practiced at courts from Cordoba in the west to Delhi in the east. The tradition remained vital and productive, with new commentaries, refinements, and applications continuing to appear. It was this living tradition, not merely a body of ancient texts, that awaited encounter with the scholars of medieval Christendom. When European translators began their work of rendering Arabic learning into Latin, they found not a museum of antiquarian curiosities, but a sophisticated and ongoing scientific enterprise, one that offered answers to questions that Christian Europe was just beginning to ask. The Iberian Peninsula in the 11th century was a land of remarkable cultural complexity, a place where three great civilizations met and mingled in ways that would prove transformative for the history of Western thought. In the south, the remnants of the once mighty caliphate of Cordoba had fragmented into smaller kingdoms known as tifas, keys, ruled by competing Muslim dynasties, yet still preserving the rich intellectual heritage of Al-Andalus. In the north, Christian kingdoms were slowly expanding southward in what later generations would call the Reconquista, a centuries-long process of territorial acquisition that brought Christian rulers into possession of cities that had been centers of Islamic learning. Between these worlds, Jewish communities served as crucial intermediaries, their scholars fluent in Arabic, Hebrew, and increasingly in Latin, capable of bridging linguistic and cultural divides that few others could cross. It was in this environment of cultural contact and exchange that the great translation movement began, to equate the systematic effort to render the scientific and philosophical works of the Arabic tradition into Latin, making them accessible to the scholars of Christian Europe. The motivations behind this enterprise were varied. Some translators were driven by pure intellectual curiosity, eager to recover the lost wisdom of antiquity that the Arabs had preserved and expanded. Others were motivated by practical concerns, recognizing that the Arabic sciences of astronomy, medicine, and mathematics far surpassed anything available in the Latin West. Still others may have been driven by religious or political considerations, seeking to appropriate the learning of the Islamic world for the greater glory of Christendom. Whatever their motivations, the translators accomplished something extraordinary, opening a window through which the light of Arabic learning would flood into the relative darkness of early medieval Europe. The city of Toledo became the most important center of this translation activity after its conquest by King Alfonso VI of Castile in 1085. Toledo had been a major intellectual center under Islamic rule, home to libraries containing thousands of Arabic manuscripts on every branch of knowledge. When the city passed into Christian hands, these libraries remained largely intact, and the substantial population of Arabic-speaking Christians and Jews who remained in the city possessed the linguistic skills necessary to make their contents accessible to Latin readers. Over the following 2 centuries, Toledo would produce Latin translations of hundreds of Arabic works, fundamentally reshaping European intellectual culture. The translators who worked in Toledo and other Spanish centers were a diverse group, drawn from various religious and ethnic backgrounds, but united by their command of languages and their passion for learning. Among the earliest and most important was Adelard of Bath, an English scholar who traveled extensively in the Islamic world in the early 12th century, learning Arabic and acquiring manuscripts that he would later translate into Latin. Adelard's translations included astronomical tables and treatises on the astrolabe, the sophisticated instrument used for observing and calculating celestial positions. His work demonstrated to European scholars the existence of a vast body of astronomical and astrological knowledge that remained inaccessible to those who knew only Latin. Hermann of Carinthia, a scholar from the region that is now Slovenia, was another pivotal figure in the early translation movement. Working in Spain in the 1140s, Hermann produced Latin versions of several important astrological texts, including Abu Machar's Great Introduction to Astrology, the philosophical masterwork that would establish the theoretical foundations of medieval European astrology. Hermann's translation of this text, completed in 1140, made available to Latin readers for the first time a comprehensive account of why and how the stars influenced earthly affairs. The impact was profound. Key for Abu Machar's Aristotelian framework provided exactly the kind of philosophical justification that would allow astrology to be accepted in the emerging university system of medieval Europe. The most prolific of all the Toledo translators was Gerard of Cremona, an Italian scholar who came to Spain in search of Ptolemy's Almagest, the great astronomical treatise that was known to exist in Arabic but was unavailable in Latin. Gerard found his Ptolemy, but he found much more besides, and he remained in Toledo for the rest of his life, producing Latin translations of some 80 Arabic works on astronomy, astrology, mathematics, medicine, and philosophy. His translations included many of the foundational texts of Arabic astrology, works by Mashallah, Salah ibn Bishr, and other authorities whose methods and concepts would shape European astrological practice for centuries. Gerard worked with teams of collaborators, typically including Arabic-speaking Christians or Jews, who would provide oral translations that Gerard then rendered into polished Latin. This collaborative method allowed for remarkable productivity, though it sometimes introduced errors and ambiguities that later scholars would struggle to resolve. The process of translation was far more than a mechanical transfer of words from one language to another. The translators faced immense challenges in rendering Arabic technical vocabulary into Latin, a language that often lacked equivalent terms for the concepts being expressed. New Latin words had to be coined or borrowed, and existing words had to be given new technical meanings. The very word for astrology in medieval Latin, astrologia, had previously been used interchangeably with astronomia to mean the study of the stars in general. Under the influence of the translations, a distinction emerged, with astronomia referring to the mathematical calculation of celestial positions, and astrologia designating the interpretation of celestial influences on earthly affairs. This distinction, though never absolute, shaped medieval thinking about the relationship between the two disciplines. Beyond Toledo, other centers contributed to the translation enterprise. In Sicily, another region where Christian, Muslim, and Jewish cultures intersected, scholars produced translations of Arabic texts under the patronage of the Norman kings. The great court of Frederick II in the 13th century would become particularly notable for its support of Arabic learning, attracting scholars from across the Mediterranean world. In southern France, Jewish scholars translated Arabic works into Hebrew, and from Hebrew into Latin, creating alternative pathways for the transmission of knowledge. In northern Italy, commercial contacts with the Islamic world facilitated cultural exchange, and Italian scholars began to learn Arabic and produce their own translations. The astrological texts that emerged from this translation movement fell into several categories, each serving different purposes and audiences. Introductory works, such as Abu Machar's Great Introduction and the shorter introduction attributed to the same author, provided theoretical foundations and basic instruction in astrological principles. More advanced treatises dealt with specific branches of the art, such as nativities, interrogations, elections, and mundane astrology. Practical manuals offered step-by-step instructions for calculating horoscopes and interpreting their features. Astronomical tables provided the numerical data necessary for determining planetary positions at any given time and place. Together, these texts constituted a comprehensive curriculum in celestial science, allowing dedicated students to progress from basic principles to advanced practice. The reception of this astrological knowledge in medieval Europe was enthusiastic, but not uncritical. European scholars did not simply accept the Arabic teachings passively, but engaged with them actively, questioning, comparing, and sometimes revising what they received. The existence of multiple translations of the same work, sometimes differing significantly in their renderings, forced scholars to think carefully about the meaning of the texts they studied. The encounter with Arabic learning also stimulated original thinking. As European scholars began to apply the new techniques to their own circumstances, and to ask questions that the Arabic authorities had not addressed. One immediate effect of the translations was to reveal to European scholars how much they did not know. The sophisticated mathematics underlying big astronomical calculations far exceeded anything available in the Latin tradition. The elaborate systems of astrological interpretation, with their dozens of rules and subtle distinctions, made the simple Star Lord that had survived in the medieval West seem crude by comparison. European scholars responded to this revelation with a mixture of humility and ambition, recognizing their own limitations while eagerly working to master the new learning that had become available to them. The translations also raised difficult questions about the compatibility of astrology with Christian faith. The Arabic authors, whose works now circulated in Latin, had written within an Islamic intellectual context, and their assumptions about cosmology, causation, and fate did not always align easily with Christian doctrine. The theory of great conjunctions, which seemed to predict the rise and fall of religions, was particularly troubling from a Christian perspective. If Islam and Christianity were both merely phases in a cosmic cycle, what did this imply about the truth claims of the Christian faith? If the stars determined the course of history, what room remained for divine providence and human free will? These questions would occupy theologians for centuries, producing a rich literature of debate and dispute. The Jewish communities of medieval Spain played a crucial role in the transmission process that is often underappreciated. Jewish scholars possessed linguistic skills that made them indispensable mediators between Arabic and Latin culture. Many of the translators employed Jewish collaborators who provided the initial oral translations from Arabic that were then polished into Latin prose. Jewish scholars also produced their own extensive astrological literature in Hebrew, both translations from Arabic and original compositions, creating a parallel tradition that sometimes influenced Latin developments. The great Jewish philosopher Maimonides, though himself skeptical of astrology, acknowledged its prevalence in Jewish communities and the need to address it seriously. One particularly influential figure in the Jewish astrological tradition was Abraham ibn Ezra, Spanish Jewish scholar of the 12th century, who spent much of his life wandering through Christian Europe, spreading astrological knowledge wherever he went. Ibn Ezra wrote extensively on astrology in Hebrew, producing works that covered the full range of the art, from basic principles to advanced techniques. His writings were later translated into Latin and other European languages, providing another channel through which Arabic astrological learning reached Christian scholars. Ibn Ezra's works were notable for their clarity and accessibility, making complex technical material available to readers who might struggle with more advanced treatises. The physical manuscripts that embodied this new learning were themselves objects of fascination and value. Unlike the simple codices that had sufficed for the limited Latin learning of the early medieval period, astrological manuscripts often required elaborate tables, diagrams, and illustrations. The zodiacal signs, the planetary symbols, the configurations of the houses, all demanded visual representation. Scribes and illuminators developed conventions for depicting celestial imagery, creating a distinctive visual vocabulary that would persist throughout the medieval period and beyond. The finest astrological manuscripts were works of art as well as science, their pages adorned with golden stars and colorful zodiacal figures. The transformation wrought by the translation movement was gradual, but ultimately revolutionary. In the space of roughly 2 centuries, European intellectual culture was fundamentally reshaped by the influx of Arabic learning. Astrology was only one component of this transformation, which also encompassed philosophy, medicine, mathematics, and natural science more broadly, but it was a particularly visible and influential component. By the end of the 13th century, no educated European could be ignorant of astrology, even if they rejected its claims. The language of celestial influence had become part of the common intellectual currency, shaping how people thought about medicine, politics, history, and the human condition. The transmission was not merely of texts, but of a worldview, a way of understanding the relationship between heaven and earth that would dominate European thought for centuries. The cosmos revealed by the Arabic texts was ordered, meaningful, and connected. Events on earth were not random, but reflected the stately movements of the celestial spheres. Human beings were not isolated individuals, but microcosms containing within themselves the same elemental principles that governed the larger universe: sickness and health, fortune and misfortune, the rise and fall of kingdoms. All were woven into the fabric of cosmic order that the astrologer could learn to read. This vision of a connected, meaningful universe was profoundly attractive to medieval minds, and it would prove remarkably durable, surviving challenges and critiques to remain influential well into the early modern period. As the 13th century dawned, the initial phase of transmission was largely complete. The major Arabic astrological texts were now available in Latin, and European scholars had begun the work of mastering, teaching, and applying this knowledge. The next chapters in the story of medieval astrology would unfold not in the translation centers of Spain and Sicily, but in the universities and courts of Christian Europe, where the celestial science would find new institutional homes and new applications. The stars that had guided caliphs in Baghdad would now illuminate the paths of popes and kings, physicians and philosophers in a transformed Latin Christendom. The physician stood at the bedside of his patient, observing the fevered flush of the skin, the rapid pulse beneath his fingers, the labored breathing that spoke of internal struggle. But his diagnosis would not rest on these physical signs alone. Before prescribing any treatment, before letting a single drop of blood or administering any herb, he would need to consult the heavens. For in the medieval world, medicine and astrology were not separate disciplines, but 2 aspects of a single science, united by the fundamental principle that the human body was a microcosm reflecting the greater cosmos, subject to the same celestial influences that governed all earthly things. To treat the body without understanding its relationship to the stars was to work in dangerous ignorance, risking harm to the very patient one sought to heal. This intimate connection between medicine and astrology had ancient roots, stretching back to the physicians of Greece and Egypt who had first articulated the theory of humors that would dominate medical thinking for nearly 2 millennia. According to this theory, the human body contained 4 fundamental fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, whose balance determined health and whose imbalance produced disease. Each humor possessed specific qualities of heat, coldness, moisture, and dryness. Blood was hot and moist, phlegm, cold and moist, yellow bile, hot and dry, and black bile, cold and dry. These same qualities characterized the 4 elements: fire, water, air, and earth, and crucially, they also characterized the celestial bodies, whose influence shaped everything in the sublunary realm. The planets in this system were not merely distant points of light, but active principles that continually affected the humoral balance of every living thing. Saturn, cold and dry, strengthened black bile, and inclined toward melancholy, causing conditions characterized by heaviness, slowness, and depression. Jupiter, warm and moist, supported the sanguine humor, promoting growth, health, and optimism. Mars, hot and dry, inflamed the choleric humor, bringing fevers, inflammations, and violent illnesses. Venus, warm and moist like Jupiter, but gentler in her influence, coming. The generative and pleasurable aspects of bodily life. Mercury, variable in nature, affected the nervous system and the mental faculties. The sun ruled the vital spirit and the heart, while the moon governed the moisture, the brain, and the rhythmic processes of the body. The zodiacal signs extended this system of correspondences to the very structure of the human form. Medieval physicians inherited from antiquity the concept of melethesia, the assignment of zodiacal rulership over different parts of the body. Aries ruled the head, Taurus the neck and throat, Gemini the arms and shoulders, Cancer the chest and stomach, Leo the heart and back, Virgo the intestines, Libra the kidneys and lower back, Scorpio the reproductive organs, Sagittarius the thighs, Capricorn the knees, Aquarius the calves and ankles, and Pisces the feet. This was not mere symbolism, but was believed to describe real connections, so that when the moon passed through a particular sign, the corresponding body part was especially sensitive and vulnerable. A surgeon who operated on the head when the moon was in Aries risked dangerous complications, while the same procedure performed when the moon occupied a more distant sign would proceed more safely. The practice of astrological medicine required the physician to cast and interpret horoscopes at multiple points in the diagnostic and therapeutic process. A chart for the moment when the patient first fell ill, known as a decomposure, could reveal the nature and severity of the disease, its likely duration, and its probable outcome. The positions of the planets in this chart were analyzed with particular attention to the rulers of the first house, representing the patient, and the sixth house, traditionally associated with illness. If the ruler of the ascendant was strong and well aspected, the prognosis was favorable. If it was weak, afflicted by malefic planets, or applying to dangerous aspects, the physician might warn the family to prepare for the worst. The timing of treatment was as important as the treatment itself. Medieval medical texts are filled with instructions for choosing auspicious moments to administer remedies, let blood, or perform surgical procedures. Bloodletting, one of the most common medical interventions of the period, was particularly subject to astrological regulation. Physicians were advised never to bleed from a part of the body ruled by the sign the moon currently occupied, for the increased lunar influence would cause excessive bleeding. The phase of the moon mattered as well, with the waning moon generally preferred for procedures intended to reduce or eliminate something from the body, while the waxing moon favored treatments intended to strengthen or build up. The aspects formed by the moon to other planets further modified these general rules, creating a complex calculus that the conscientious physician was expected to master. The preparation of medicines was similarly governed by celestial considerations. Herbs and other medicinal substances were classified according to their planetary rulerships, with each plant believed to embody the nature and virtues of its governing planet. Herbs of the sun, such as saffron and chamomile, were warming and vitalizing, appropriate for conditions of coldness and weakness. Herbs of the moon, including lettuce and watercress, were cooling and moistening, useful for fevers and inflammations. Herbs of Mars, such as garlic and mustard, were heating and stimulating, while herbs of Venus, including vervain and myrtle, governed matters of love and fertility. The skilled herbalist gathered plants at times when their ruling planets were strong, prepared medicines under favorable celestial configurations, and administered them when the heavens supported their action. The great medical schools of medieval Europe incorporated astrology into their formal curricula, treating it as an essential component of medical education rather than an optional supplement. At the University of Bologna, founded in the late 11th century and famous throughout Europe for its medical faculty, students were required to study astrology as part of their training. Similar requirements existed at Montpellier, Padua, Paris, and other centers of medical learning. The statutes of these institutions typically specified that medical students must possess competence in astronomy and astrology before being licensed to practice, and examinations tested candidates on their ability to cast charts and interpret celestial influences on health and disease. The most influential medical authorities of the medieval period took astrology for granted as part of their art. Pietro d'Urbano, physician and philosopher who taught at Padua in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, wrote extensively on medical astrology, producing a treatise called the Conciliator that attempted to reconcile apparent contradictions between different medical authorities while incorporating astrological principles throughout. His work was widely read and frequently cited, establishing him as one of the foremost medical astrologers of the medieval period. Arnold of Villanova, another celebrated physician of the same era, wrote treatises on choosing auspicious times for medical procedures and on the astrological properties of medicinal substances. These were not marginal figures, but the leading medical minds of their age, whose authorities shaped medical practice for generations. The astrological physician did not work in isolation, but was embedded in a larger culture that took celestial influence for granted. Patients expected their physicians to consider the stars, and a doctor who neglected astrology might be seen as incompetent or careless. Medical consultations often began with the casting of a horoscope. Handwritten medical reports might include astrological analysis alongside descriptions of symptoms and recommended treatments. The keeping of accurate time was therefore a medical as well as an astrological necessity, for the precise moment of the onset of illness or the administration of treatment could determine the difference between success and failure, between life and death. The theory of critical days provided another framework for understanding the course of illness through celestial principles. This theory, derived from Hippocratic and Galenic medicine, but elaborated through astrological analysis, held that diseases progressed through regular cycles, with certain days being especially significant for determining whether the patient would recover or decline. The critical days were calculated based on the motion of the moon, so was believed to complete a cycle of influence every 7 days as it passed from one quarter to the next. The 7th, 14th, and 21st days of an illness were considered particularly critical, as were days when the moon formed significant aspects to its position at the disease's onset. Physicians watched these days with special attention, expecting to see either improvement or deterioration that will reveal the illness's ultimate trajectory. Beyond the treatment of individual patients, astrology offered explanations for the great epidemics that periodically swept through medieval populations. When plague or pestilence struck a city or region, killing hundreds or thousands, people naturally sought to understand why such catastrophe had befallen them. Astrology provided answers that complemented theological explanations of divine punishment. Certain celestial configurations, particularly conjunctions of the malefic planets Saturn and Mars, their presence and signs associated with putrefaction and corruption, were believed to generate pestilential influences that corrupted the air and predisposed populations to epidemic disease. Eclipses, comets, and other unusual celestial phenomena were similarly interpreted as portents of collective suffering. The most famous example of this astrological epidemiology came in response to the Black Death, the devastating plague that swept through Europe beginning in 1347 and killed perhaps 1/3 of the continent's population. As the death toll mounted, desperate authorities sought explanations and remedies. The medical faculty of the University of Paris, one of the most prestigious in Europe, was commissioned to investigate the plague's causes and recommend preventive measures. Their report, issued in 1348, attributed the epidemic to a conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars that had occurred in 1345, which had corrupted the air and predisposed humoral imbalances that left populations vulnerable to the pestilence. This explanation was widely accepted and frequently cited in subsequent plague treatises, demonstrating how astrology provided a framework for understanding even the most catastrophic events. The connection between medicine and astrology also extended to mental illness and disorders of the mind. The moon, which governed the brain and its faculties, was particularly implicated in conditions we would now recognize as psychiatric disorders. The very word lunatic derives from luna, the Latin word for moon, preserving in language the medieval belief that mental disturbance followed lunar cycles. Melancholy, the condition of excessive black bile that produced depression, fear, and disturbed thinking, was associated with Saturn, and astrologers expected individuals with prominent Saturn placements in their birth charts to be especially susceptible to this affliction. Treatment might involve both medical and astrological interventions, ministering jovial or solar remedies to counteract Saturnine influence while choosing favorable times for therapeutic procedures. The relationship between astrology and medicine was not without its critics, even within the medieval period. Some physicians questioned whether celestial influences were really as determinative as astrological theory suggested, arguing for a more limited role for the stars in medical practice. Theological critics worried that excessive reliance on astrology might lead physicians to neglect prayer and divine providence as sources of healing. Yet these criticisms remained minority positions, unable to dislodge astrology from its central place in medieval medical thought and practice. For most physicians of the medieval period, the question was not whether to use astrology, but how to use it most effectively. The legacy of medical astrology would prove remarkably enduring, persisting long after other aspects of medieval medicine had been abandoned or transformed. Well into the 17th century, physicians continued to cast horoscopes for their patients. Time treatments, according to celestial configurations, can interpret epidemics through astrological analysis. The eventual decline of medical astrology came not from internal criticism, but from the broader transformation of natural philosophy that accompanied the scientific revolution, when new models of the cosmos and new understandings of causation rendered the old celestial medicine obsolete. Yet, even today, traces of this ancient connection between heavens and health persist in popular culture. In the association of zodiacal signs with personality types and physical constitutions, reminders of a time when the stars were believed to hold the secrets not only of fate, but of the body itself. The cathedral rose toward heaven, its spires reaching upward like prayers made stone, its windows blazing with colored light that transformed the interior into a vision of celestial glory. Within these sacred walls, priests proclaimed the sovereignty of God over all creation, the freedom of the human will to choose salvation or damnation, and the futility of seeking to know the future through any means but divine revelation. Yet, those same priests might well have consulted an astrologer before beginning construction of this very building, choosing an auspicious moment to lay the cornerstone so that the stars would favor the great work. This apparent contradiction lay at the heart of medieval Christianity's complex relationship with astrology, a relationship marked by tension, negotiation, ultimately an uneasy accommodation that allowed celestial science to flourish even under the watchful eye of the Church. The earliest Christian attitudes toward astrology were largely hostile. The Church Fathers who shaped Christian doctrine in the centuries following Christ wrote extensively against the practice of reading the stars, seeing in it a remnant of pagan superstition, incompatible with faith in the one true God. St. Augustine of Hippo, whose authority would dominate Western theology for 1,000 years, devoted considerable attention to refuting astrological claims. In his Confessions, he recounted his own youthful dalliance with astrology and his eventual rejection of it. In The City of God, he marshaled philosophical arguments against the art, pointing out that twins born at virtually the same moment under identical celestial configurations often led vastly different lives, a fact that seemed to disprove the basic premise of natal astrology. How could the stars determine fate if two individuals with the same horoscope experienced such divergent fortunes? Augustine's critique went beyond empirical objections to raise fundamental theological concerns. If the stars determined human actions, then free will was an illusion, and with it collapsed the entire moral framework of Christianity. How could God justly reward virtue and punish sin if human beings had no choice in their actions, if their deeds were compelled by celestial forces beyond their control? Moreover, if astrologers could accurately predict the future, it implied either that the future was fixed and unchangeable, denying the efficacy of prayer and divine intervention, or that knowledge properly belonging to God alone was being usurped by human practitioners of a forbidden art. Either way, astrology seemed to threaten core Christian commitments. Other church fathers echoed and elaborated these concerns. Tertullian declared that the demons had taught astrology to humanity, placing the art squarely in the category of diabolical deception. Origen argued that, while the stars might serve as signs of divine intention, they did not cause the events they signified. Just as a sundial indicates the time without causing it, this distinction between signs and causes would prove crucial in later debates, offering a possible middle ground between complete acceptance and total rejection of celestial observation. If the stars were merely signs, then reading them did not necessarily imply belief in celestial determinism, though it did raise questions about why God would embed such signs in creation and for whom they were intended. The early medieval church maintained this generally hostile posture toward astrology, though enforcement was sporadic and inconsistent. Church councils periodically condemned astrological practices, and penitential manuals prescribed penances for consulting astrologers or casting horoscopes, yet the condemnations themselves testified to the persistence of the practices they sought to prohibit. If no one was consulting astrologers, there would be no need for repeated prohibitions. The truth was that astrology never entirely disappeared from early medieval Europe, persisting in popular practice even when elite learned culture had lost access to the sophisticated technical traditions of antiquity. The Great Transformation came with the translation movement of the 12th and 13th centuries, when the recovery of Arabic astrological texts confronted the church with a fully developed celestial science backed by the authority of Aristotle and integrated into a comprehensive philosophical system. This was not mere popular superstition that could be dismissed or suppressed, but a sophisticated intellectual tradition that demanded serious engagement. The Arabic texts came accompanied by philosophical frameworks that seemed to address the very concerns the church fathers had raised, offering accounts of celestial influence that preserved free will while acknowledging stellar effects on the material world. The key figure in the theological accommodation of astrology was Thomas Aquinas, the Dominican friar whose synthesis of Aristotelian philosophy and Christian theology would become the intellectual foundation of Catholic thought. Aquinas addressed the question of astrology in multiple works, developing a nuanced position that would define the boundaries of acceptable belief and practice for centuries to come. His approach was neither to condemn astrology wholesale, nor to accept it uncritically, but to distinguish carefully between legitimate and illegitimate forms of celestial science. Aquinas began by affirming that celestial bodies did indeed influence earthly events. This was not pagan superstition, but sound Aristotelian physics. The heavenly spheres, by their motions, transmitted causative power from the divine prime mover to the sublunary realm. This celestial influence was most obvious in the effects of the sun and moon on earthly life, effects that no one could deny, but it extended to the other planets as well. The stars affected the material world, including the human body, which was part of that material world. Since the body influenced the soul through the passions and inclinations arising from bodily temperament, the stars could be said to affect human behavior indirectly, inclining, though not compelling, human choices. The crucial limitation that Aquinas placed on astrological influence concerned the human intellect and will. These faculties, he argued, were spiritual rather than material, directly created by God and not subject to celestial causation. The stars might incline a person toward anger or melancholy, generosity or avarice by affecting bodily temperament, but they could not determine the choices of a rational soul. A person might feel strong impulses arising from celestial influence, but remained free to resist or redirect those impulses through the exercise of reason and will. As Aquinas famously put it, The wise person rules the stars rather than being ruled by them. This formula preserved both the reality of celestial influence and the freedom of the human will, threading a needle that had seemed impossible to earlier critics. From this theoretical foundation, Aquinas derived practical conclusions about which astrological practices were acceptable and which were forbidden. Astrology applied to natural phenomena, such as weather, prediction, or agricultural planning, was entirely legitimate, since these matters fell within the sphere of celestial causation. Medical astrology, which concerned the body and its material processes, was similarly acceptable. Even predictions about human behavior could be valid insofar as they concerned the general tendencies arising from bodily disposition, though they could never predict specific actions of the rational will with certainty. What was forbidden was the claim to predict future contingent events that depended on human free choice, such as whether a particular person would commit a crime or achieve salvation. Such knowledge belonged to God alone, and to claim it was to fall into superstition or to invoke demonic assistance. Aquinas also distinguished between natural and judicial astrology. Natural astrology, which observed celestial effects on physical phenomena, is a legitimate branch of natural philosophy. Judicial astrology, which judged or predicted human affairs on the basis of horoscopes, was more problematic and required careful limitations. Interrogations, the practice of answering questions based on the horoscope for the moment the question was asked, seemed particularly suspect, as it implied that the stars controlled the timing and content of human inquiries. Elections, choosing favorable times for actions, occupied a gray area, acceptable when the action concerned material matters, but dubious when it aimed to influence outcomes dependent on free will. This Thomistic framework became the standard position of medieval Catholic theology, though it was always more of a spectrum than a sharp line. Individual theologians might interpret the boundaries more restrictively or more liberally, and ecclesiastical authorities varied in their willingness to enforce them. The practical result was that astrology occupied a contested but largely tolerated position within medieval Christian culture. Practitioners who stayed within the recognized boundaries could pursue their art without fear of condemnation, while those who made excessive claims or employed astrology in clearly forbidden ways risked censure or worse. The paradox of clerical astrologers illustrates the complexity of this situation. Throughout the medieval period, many of the most accomplished astrologers were themselves members of the clergy, priests, monks, and canons who saw no contradiction between their religious vocation and their celestial studies. Some held positions in cathedral chapters or religious houses, pursuing astrology as one branch of natural philosophy alongside their pastoral duties. Others served as court astrologers to bishops and popes, applying their skills to ecclesiastical as well as secular purposes. The Church never formally authorized such activities, but neither did it systematically suppress them, as long as practitioners avoided obviously forbidden territory. The University of Paris, the preeminent theological faculty in medieval Christendom, illustrates the tensions within learned Christian culture regarding astrology. On one hand, Paris was the home of the most rigorous theological scrutiny, where propositions were tested against orthodoxy and errors were condemned with binding authority. On the other hand, Paris produced many accomplished astrologers and included astrological instruction in its curriculum. The famous Condemnations of 1277, in which the Bishop of Paris prohibited the teaching of over 200 philosophical propositions, included several related to astrology, particularly those that seemed to deny free will or claim excessive certainty for astrological prediction. Yet, these condemnations did not end astrological practice or teaching at Paris, but merely reinforced the boundaries that the mystic theology had already established. The papal court itself maintained an ambivalent relationship with astrology. Several medieval popes employed astrologers or were said to have practiced the art themselves, while others issued condemnations and prohibitions. Pope Boniface VIII, who reigned at the end of the 13th century, is rumored to consult astrologers extensively, while his opponent, Pope John the 22nd, early in the 14th century, issued bulls against magical and divinatory practices, that were sometimes interpreted as targeting astrology. The Fourth Lateran Council and other ecclesiastical assemblies periodically reminded the faithful of the dangers of superstitious practices without specifically naming astrology or providing clear guidance on which specific activities were prohibited. The theological debates over astrology continued throughout the medieval period, never reaching definitive resolution. Defenders of astrology could point to its philosophical foundations in accepted Aristotelian natural philosophy and to the careful limitations that preserved free will and divine sovereignty. Critics could emphasize the practical tendency of astrological practice to exceed these theoretical limits, sliding from acceptable natural observation into forbidden judicial prediction, or even into commerce with demons who supplied knowledge beyond human capacity. Both sides could claim patristic and scriptural support, interpreting the relevant texts to favor their positions. This ongoing tension produced a distinctive medieval attitude toward astrology, one that combined genuine belief in celestial influence with awareness of the spiritual dangers of excessive reliance on the stars. The wise Christian might legitimately study the heavens, seeking to understand God's creation and to apply natural knowledge for beneficial purposes. But this study must always be tempered by humility, remembering that the stars were creatures of God rather than autonomous powers, that their influence extended only to matter and not to spirit, and that human destiny was ultimately determined not by celestial configurations, but by divine providence and human choice. Within these boundaries, medieval Christians could and did embrace astrology as a legitimate form of knowledge, one that revealed the wondrous order of God's cosmos and offered practical guidance for navigating earthly life while keeping their eyes fixed on the eternal destination that no horoscope could determine. The king sat upon his throne in the great hall, surrounded by his nobles, his counselors, his bishops, and knights, all awaiting his decision on the matter that had consumed the court for weeks. War was coming. That much seemed certain. But when to strike, when to march the army forth, when to risk everything on the outcome of battle? These questions admitted no easy answers. Military advisors offered their assessments of troop strength and strategic advantage. Diplomats reported on the intentions of allies and the weaknesses of enemies. But before the final decision could be made, another figure stepped forward, a man in scholar's robes carrying instruments of brass and parchment covered with calculations. The court astrologer had completed his work, and now he would reveal what the heavens counseled. For no medieval monarch of any consequence would launch a major campaign without first consulting the stars. The figure of the court astrologer was ubiquitous in medieval political culture, present in kingdoms and principalities across Europe, serving rulers who ranged from the mightiest emperors to the pettiest local lords. These astrologers occupied a unique position in the hierarchy of advisors, possessing knowledge that no one else at court could provide, knowledge that seemed to come from the very structure of the cosmos itself. Their influence varied enormously depending on the personality of the ruler they served and the accuracy of their previous predictions. But at their height, court astrologers could shape the destiny of nations, their interpretations of celestial science providing the framework within which crucial decisions were made. The services that court astrologers provided fell into several categories. Most fundamental was the casting and interpretation of the ruler's nativity, the horoscope for the moment of birth that revealed the native's character, fortune, and fate. A king's birth chart was a document of state importance, studied and restudied throughout his reign for indications of future developments, the progressions and directions of natal planets. Technical methods for tracking how the birth chart unfolded over time were monitored constantly, with astrologers alerting their patrons to approaching periods of danger or opportunity. When princes were born, their nativities were cast immediately and analyzed with intense attention, for these charts would guide expectations and preparations for the child's eventual rule. Elections constituted another major category of astrological service. The practice of choosing auspicious moments for important actions was deeply embedded in medieval political culture, applied to an enormous range of activities, from coronations to military campaigns, from the signing of treaties to the laying of foundation stones for castles and cathedrals. The theory behind electoral astrology was straightforward. Since celestial configurations influenced earthly events, beginning an action under favorable stars increased its chances of success, while starting under malefic configurations invited failure and disaster. The skilled electoral astrologer knew how to identify moments when the heavens favored the particular type of action contemplated, balancing multiple factors to find optimal or at least acceptable times for proceeding. Coronations were particularly important occasions for electoral astrology. The moment when a king was crowned and anointed established a kind of birth chart for his reign, a celestial signature that would color everything that followed. Astrologers labored to identify times when royal significators were strong, when benefic planets occupied powerful positions, and when malefic influences were minimized or contained. The historical record preserves accounts of coronations that were delayed or rescheduled based on astrological advice, as well as debates among astrologers about which configurations best suited the assumption of royal power. Some rulers were so convinced of the importance of the coronation horoscope that they kept the elected moment secret, fearing that enemies might use it to work magic against them. Military astrology was perhaps the most consequential application of celestial science at medieval courts. Before committing armies to battle, prudent commanders sought astrological counsel on the most favorable times to engage the enemy. The techniques for judging battles were elaborate, involving analysis of the significators for both sides, the condition of martial planets, the state of the houses associated with conflict and victory, a chart showing the ruler's significator, strong and well placed, while the enemy's was weak and afflicted, promised success, while the reverse configuration counseled delay or negotiation. Some military commanders carried personal astrologers on campaign, consulting them before each engagement and adjusting tactics based on daily celestial configurations. The role of court astrologer carried both rewards and risks. Successful predictions brought favor, gifts, and influence, elevating the astrologer to positions of trust and confidence. Royal patronage could make an astrologer wealthy and famous, sought after by other princes and praised by chroniclers. But failure was always possible, and the consequences could be severe. An astrologer who predicted victory when defeat followed, or who assured the king of safety when danger lurked, might find himself disgraced, dismissed, or worse. The historical sources record astrologers who were imprisoned, exiled, or even executed when their predictions proved catastrophically wrong. The profession demanded not only technical skill, but also political acumen, the ability to navigate court intrigues and to present predictions in ways that protected the astrologer regardless of outcome. The English court provides numerous examples of royal engagement with astrology throughout the medieval period. Kings from William the Conqueror onward are recorded consulting astrologers or receiving astrological advice. One of the most detailed accounts concerns the court of King Henry II in the 12th century, where the astrologer and scholar Roger of Hereford enjoyed royal favor and produced astrological works dedicated to his patron. Later, English kings continued this tradition, with astrologers serving in various capacities, from informal advisors to formally appointed officers. The turbulent period of the Wars of the Roses saw intense astrological activity on all sides, with rival claimants to the throne seeking celestial validation for their causes. The French court was similarly engaged with astrology, and French kings maintained astrologers among their regular advisors. The reign of Charles V of France in the 14th century marked a particular high point of royal astrological patronage. Charles was renowned for his learning and his interest in the sciences, and he assembled a remarkable library that included numerous astrological texts. He patronized astrologers and commissioned translations of astrological works into French. making celestial knowledge accessible to those who could not read Latin. The astrologer Thomas of Pisano served at his court and produced works that reflected the king's interests. Charles's patronage established a tradition of French royal engagement with astrology that would continue for centuries. The Italian peninsula, politically fragmented among numerous city-states, principalities, and the Papal territories, provided fertile ground for astrological practice. Italian courts competed for prestige in cultural and intellectual matters, and maintaining a distinguished astrologer became a mark of sophistication and power. Sfacanti and Sforza, rulers of Milan, the Este of Ferrara, the Gonzaga of Mantua, and many other Italian dynasties patronized astrologers and integrated astrological advice into their governance. The university cities of Bologna and Padua trained generations of astrologers who went on to serve at courts throughout Italy and beyond. Italian astrology achieved a particular reputation for sophistication and accuracy, drawing students from across Europe to learn from its masters. The Holy Roman Empire, the sprawling confederation of German and Central European territories, nominally united under an elected emperor, had its own rich tradition of court astrology. German princes and imperial electors maintained astrologers, and the imperial court itself employed celestial advisors. The close connection between the empire and the papacy meant that astrological practice in this region was sometimes caught up in the larger tensions between secular and religious authority. But this did not prevent the art from flourishing. German astrologers produced important technical works and served at courts from Vienna to Prague to the lesser principalities of the empire's complex political landscape. Beyond their role in specific decisions, court astrologers served broader functions in medieval political culture. They provided a framework for understanding and narrating political events, explaining why kingdoms rose and fell, why particular rulers succeeded or failed, why wars were won or lost. This explanatory function was valuable to rulers seeking to legitimate their power or to justify their actions. A king who could claim that the stars favored his dynasty possessed a form of cosmic endorsement that supplemented religious and hereditary justifications for rule. Conversely, unfavorable astrological indications could be used to undermine rivals, suggesting that their reigns were doomed by celestial decree. The Great Conjunction Theory, developed by Arabic astrologers and transmitted to Europe through the translations, provided a particularly powerful framework for political astrology. The regular meetings of Saturn and Jupiter, the two most distant visible planets, marked turning points in human history, with the most significant conjunctions coinciding with the rise of new dynasties and religions. Medieval astrologers applied this theory to contemporary politics, calculating when great conjunctions would occur and interpreting their significance for the powers of Europe. The approach of a great conjunction generated intense speculation about what changes it might bring, and rulers sought to position themselves favorably in relation to these cosmic milestones. Propaganda was another function served by court astrology. Astrologers could produce interpretations that supported their patrons' policies and undermined those of rivals. Predictions of victory boosted morale among supporters and might demoralize enemies. Claims that the stars favored a particular course of action provided justification that transcended merely human judgment. Royal horoscopes could be analyzed to reveal virtues and destined greatness, reinforcing the image of the ruler that the court wished to project. This propagandistic use of astrology was well understood by contemporaries who might receive astrological claims with some skepticism when they served obvious political purposes. The relationship between astrologer and patron was thus complex and multifaceted, involving genuine belief in celestial influence alongside political calculation and personal ambition. Rulers who consulted astrologers were not simply credulous fools deceived by charlatans, but sophisticated political actors who found astrology useful for multiple purposes. The astrologers themselves were typically learned men, trained in the mathematical and philosophical traditions of their time, who brought genuine expertise to their service. The institution of court astrology persisted because it met real needs, providing a language for discussing uncertainty, a framework for making difficult decisions, and a source of cosmic meaning in a world where meaning was desperately sought. The medieval period drew toward its close. Court astrology remained deeply embedded in European political culture, practiced at every level, from the greatest monarchies to the smallest lordships. The Renaissance would see this tradition continue and even intensify, with famous astrologers serving the most powerful rulers of the age. Only gradually, over the course of the 16th and 17th centuries, would the institution decline, as new models of statecraft and new understandings of the cosmos rendered the court astrologer obsolete. But for the medieval world, the stars were living guides to political action, for no ruler who wished to be thought-wise could afford to ignore their counsel. The young scholar climbed the worn stone steps of the university building, his arms laden with books and instruments, his mind filled with the lessons of the morning lecture. He had come to this great center of learning from a distant province, drawn by the reputation of its masters and the promise of knowledge that could not be found elsewhere. For years now, he had progressed through the curriculum, mastering grammar and rhetoric, logic and arithmetic, geometry and music. Hata, it was the final art of the quadrivium that most captivated him. The study of the heavens that united mathematical precision with cosmic meaning. Here in the university, astrology was not a marginal pursuit or a forbidden curiosity, but a recognized branch of natural philosophy, taught by distinguished professors, examined in formal disputations, and considered essential preparation for the higher faculties of medicine, law, and theology. The medieval university was one of the great institutional innovations of European civilization, a new kind of community dedicated to the pursuit and transmission of knowledge. Emerging in the 12th and 13th centuries, universities quickly spread across Europe, from Bologna and Paris to Oxford and Cambridge, from Padua and Montpellier to Prague and Krakow. These institutions developed standardized curricula, formal examinations, and recognized degrees, creating a common intellectual culture that transcended political boundaries. Within this academic world, astrology found a secure home, integrated into the curriculum and cultivated by generations of scholars who saw it as an indispensable component of a complete education. The place of astrology within the university curriculum derived from its relationship to astronomy, and both were grounded in the classical conception of the liberal arts. The quadrivium, the four mathematical arts that formed the advanced portion of the arts curriculum, consisted of arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. These disciplines were understood as progressive stages in the study of number and proportion, with astronomy representing the application of mathematical principles to the motions of the heavens. In medieval understanding, astronomy and astrology were not sharply distinguished as separate disciplines, but were seen as complementary aspects of celestial science. Astronomy provided the mathematical foundations, calculating planetary positions and predicting celestial events. Astrology interpreted the significance of these positions and events, applying astronomical knowledge to understanding earthly affairs. The standard astronomical textbook of the medieval university was the Sphere of Sacrobosco, 13th century treatise by the English scholar John of Holywood that provided a clear and accessible introduction to the structure of the cosmos and the basic principles of celestial motion. Students who mastered this text gained the conceptual framework necessary for understanding how the heavens moved and how their movements could be calculated. From this foundation, they could proceed to more advanced works, including the tables and techniques necessary for casting horoscopes. The Alphonsine tables, compiled under the patronage of King Alfonso X of Castile in the 13th century, became the standard resource for determining planetary positions, enabling students to calculate the celestial configurations for any given time and place. Astrological instruction proper began once students had mastered these astronomical preliminaries. The curriculum typically included introductory works that explained the fundamental concepts of astrological interpretation, such as the natures of the planets, the meanings of the zodiacal signs, and the significance of the 12 houses. The introductions of Abu Mashar, available in Latin translation, served this purpose admirably, providing philosophical justification for astrology alongside practical instruction. From these introductions, students progressed to more specialized treatises dealing with the various branches of the art: nativities, elections, interrogations, and mundane astrology. The works of Ptolemy, particularly the Tetrabiblos, enjoyed special authority. Though they were often read alongside later commentaries that elaborated and sometimes corrected the ancient masters' teachings, the teaching methods of the medieval university emphasized close reading and formal disputation. Students attended lectures in which masters read and commented upon authoritative texts, explaining difficult passages and exploring their implications. Participated in disputations, structured debates in which propositions were defended and attacked according to rigorous logical procedures. Astrological topics appeared in both contexts. Lectures on astrological texts transmitted technical knowledge and interpretive traditions. Disputations tested students' ability to defend or refute astrological claims, sharpening their argumentative skills while deepening their understanding of the subjects. Complexities and controversies. The University of Bologna, renowned throughout Europe for its faculties of law and medicine, was a major center of astrological instruction. Medical students at Bologna were required to demonstrate competence in astrology before receiving their degrees. Since medical practice was so thoroughly intertwined with celestial science, the university maintained chairs of astrology, and distinguished astrologers held teaching positions that brought them both income and prestige. Guido Bonatti, one of the most famous astrologers of the 13th century, was associated with Bologna, though he spent much of his career in the service of various Italian lords. His massive Liber Astronomia, a comprehensive treatise covering all branches of astrology, became a standard reference work, studied and cited for centuries after its composition. The University of Padua emerged as another major center of astrological learning, particularly in the later medieval period. Padua's medical faculty rivaled that of Bologna, and its commitment to astrological instruction was equally strong. The chair of astrology at Padua attracted distinguished scholars, and the university produced numerous astrological works that circulated throughout Europe. Pietro Dovano was a physician and philosopher whose conciliator attempted to reconcile divergent medical authorities. Taught at Padua and contributed significantly to the development of medical astrology. Later, Paduan scholars continued this tradition, making the university a beacon for students who wished to master the celestial science at the highest level. The University of Paris, though primarily renowned for its theological faculty, also provided significant astrological instruction within its arts curriculum. The tensions between astrological practice and theological orthodoxy were more acute at Paris than at the Italian universities, given the proximity of the theology faculty and its vigilance against philosophical errors. The condemnations of 1277 had targeted certain astrological propositions, and Parisian masters needed to navigate carefully between legitimate natural philosophy and forbidden determinism. Despite these constraints, astrology was taught and practiced at Paris, and many distinguished astrologers received their training there before going on to careers at courts or other universities. Oxford and Cambridge, the two English universities, incorporated astrology into their curricula following continental models. English scholars had been among the pioneers of the translation movement, and figures like Adelard of Bath and Roger of Hereford had helped introduce Arabic celestial science to the Latin West. The English universities built upon this foundation, training students in the mathematical and interpretive techniques of astrology. Roger Bacon, the 13th century Franciscan friar who taught at Oxford and Paris, was an enthusiastic advocate of celestial science, arguing that astrology could be used to predict and even prepare for significant historical events. Though Bacon's more extravagant claims attracted criticism, his writings contributed to the intellectual legitimacy of astrological study in the English academic context. The career path of the university-trained astrologer varied considerably depending on individual circumstances and opportunities. Some graduates remained in academic settings, teaching astrology and related subjects at the universities where they had studied or at others that offered positions. Others entered the service of courts, applying their skills to the political and military needs of princes and nobles. Still others practiced privately, casting horoscopes for paying clients who sought guidance on matters ranging from marriage and travel to business ventures and medical concerns. The medical profession absorbed many astrologically trained graduates, since physicians were expected to possess celestial knowledge as part of their professional competence. Some astrologers combined multiple roles, holding academic positions while also serving at court or accepting private clients. The production of astrological texts was closely connected to university culture. Scholars teaching in university settings composed treatises that synthesized existing knowledge, clarified difficult points, and sometimes advanced new interpretations or techniques. These works circulated among students and colleagues, contributing to a shared body of knowledge that crossed political and linguistic boundaries. The manuscript culture of the medieval period meant that texts spread relatively slowly, copied by hand, and transmitted through personal networks. But the university system provided infrastructure for this transmission, with libraries collecting important works and scribes producing copies for teaching and study. Examinations and degree requirements formalized the astrological competence expected of university graduates. Students seeking degrees in the arts or in medicine might be examined on their ability to cast and interpret horoscopes, their knowledge of planetary natures and zodiacal significations, and their understanding of the theoretical foundations of celestial influence. These examinations ensured a baseline level of competence and contributed to the professional identity of those who passed them. A university degree certified not merely general learning, but specific technical skills, including the skills required for astrological practice. The intellectual culture of the medieval university fostered both conservatism and innovation in astrological thought. On the conservative side, the curriculum emphasized mastery of authoritative texts. Deference to established authorities was a deeply ingrained habit of mind. Students learned what Ptolemy and Abu Mashar had taught, and they were trained to respect these teachings rather than to challenge them. On the innovative side, the practice of disputation encouraged critical thinking, and the encounter between different textual traditions sometimes revealed tensions and contradictions that stimulated new thinking. University-trained astrologers were not merely passive recipients of tradition, but active participants in an ongoing intellectual conversation. The physical instruments of astrological practice were also objects of university attention. The astrolabe is that versatile device for observing celestial positions and performing astronomical calculations, was studied and used in university settings. Students learned to construct and operate astrolabes, acquiring practical skills that complemented their theoretical knowledge. Other instruments, such as quadrants and equatoria, expanded the astrologer's technical capabilities. The university environment provided opportunities to examine and compare different instruments, to learn their uses from experienced practitioners, and to develop the manual dexterity that effective astronomical observation required. As the medieval period progressed, the university culture of astrology grew ever more sophisticated and institutionalized. By the 15th century, chairs of astrology were established features of major universities, and the publication of astrological almanacs and prognostications had become a regular feature of academic life. The advent of printing in the mid-15th century would transform the circulation of astrological texts, making them more widely available than ever before and inaugurating a new era in the history of celestial science. But the foundations laid in the medieval university, the curricula and methods, the texts and traditions, the professional identities and career paths would continue to shape astrological practice long after the medieval period had ended. The stars that medieval students learned to read would shine over a changing world. but the light they cast still bore the character of those long-ago lecture halls and library shelves, where young minds first learned to trace the connections between heaven and earth. The astrologer sat at his desk as the candle flickered, casting dancing shadows across the parchment before him. Spread out were his tools, the astronomical tables that gave planetary positions for any date, the brass astrolabe that helped him calculate the rising degree, the compass and straight edge for drawing the figure of the heavens. A client had come to him that morning with a question that had tormented her for months, and now he would seek the answer in the stars. But first, he must construct the horoscope itself, that intricate diagram that captured the celestial configuration of a single moment, freezing the ever-moving heavens into a static image that could be analyzed, interpreted, and made to yield its secrets. This was the fundamental act of astrological practice, the creation of the chart that served as the foundation for all that followed. The construction of a medieval horoscope began with determining the positions, the 7 traditional planets at the moment in question. The sun and moon, counted among the planets in the geocentric system, moved through the zodiac at relatively predictable rates, the sun completing its circuit in a year, the moon in roughly a month. The 5 visible planets, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, each had their own periods, Mercury and Venus never straying far from the sun, while Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn wandered more widely through the zodiacal signs. To find these positions, the astrologer consulted astronomical tables, complex documents that recorded planetary motions and allowed calculation of positions for any desired date and time. The most widely used tables in medieval Europe were the Teledon tables, compiled in the 11th century by a team of astronomers working in Toledo under the patronage of Muslim rulers, and later the Alphonsine tables, produced under the sponsorship of King Alfonso X of Castile in the 13th century. These tables represented remarkable achievements of astronomical calculation, synthesizing observations and mathematical models to predict planetary positions with impressive accuracy. Using them required substantial mathematical skill, for the raw data had to be adjusted for the user's location and the specific date in question. The process involved hours of careful calculation, checking and rechecking to ensure that errors did not creep in and corrupt the final result. Once the planetary positions were determined, the astrologer turned to the calculation of the houses, the 12 divisions of the heavens that structured the horoscope's interpretation. Unlike the zodiacal signs, which were fixed divisions of the ecliptic, the houses rotated with the daily motion of the heavens, completing a full cycle every 24 hours. The starting point for the house system was the ascendant, the degree of the zodiac rising over the eastern horizon at the moment of the chart. This point changed approximately every 4 minutes, making precise time determination crucial for accurate horoscopy. A birth that occurred at dawn would have a very different ascendant than one at noon or midnight, and this difference would significantly affect the chart's interpretation. Medieval astrologers employed several different systems for dividing the houses, each with its advocates and its mathematical basis. The system most commonly used was that attributed to Alcabitius, an Arabic astrologer of the 10th century, which divided the diurnal and nocturnal arcs of the ascendant into 3 equal parts. Other systems divided the celestial equator or the prime vertical, producing different house cusps and therefore different interpretations. This big choice of house system was not merely technical, but could affect which planets fell in which houses, and therefore what predictions emerged from the chart. Debates over the correct house system continued throughout the medieval period, and indeed persist among astrologers to this day. With planets placed in signs and houses, the astrologer next assessed the essential dignities and abilities of each planet. This system, elaborated by Arabic astrologers and transmitted to Europe through the translations, specified the conditions under which a planet was strong or weak, well-placed or ill-placed in the zodiac. Each planet ruled certain signs, called its domiciles, where it was most powerful. The sun ruled Leo, the moon Cancer, Mercury ruled both Gemini and Virgo. Venus, both Taurus and Libra. Mars, both Aries and Scorpio. Jupiter, both Sagittarius and Pisces. And Saturn, both Capricorn and Aquarius. A planet in its own domicile was like a lord in his own castle, operating from a position of strength and authority. Beyond domicile rulership, the dignity system included exaltations. Signs where planets were especially honored and powerful, and their opposites, the falls. The sun was exalted in Aries, the moon in Taurus, Mercury in Virgo, Venus in Pisces, Mars in Capricorn, Jupiter in Cancer, and Saturn in Libra. A planet in its exaltation was like an honored guest, powerful, but in a different way than in its domicile. The triplicities assigned planetary rulers to the 4 groups of signs, sharing the same element with different rulers for day and night charts. The terms or bounds divided each sign into 5 unequal segments, each ruled by a different planet. The faces or decans divided each sign into 3 10-degree segments with their own planetary associations. A planet accumulating many dignities was said to be essentially strong, while one lacking dignities or occupying signs of its detriment or fall was essentially weak. The aspects between planets formed another crucial layer of interpretation. Medieval astrology recognized 5 major aspects. Geometric relationships formed when planets occupied signs at specific distances from each other. The conjunction occurred when planets occupied the same degree or very close degrees of the zodiac. The opposition placed planets 180 degrees apart on opposite sides of the heavens. The trine separated planets by 120 degrees, the square by 90 degrees, and the sextile by 60 degrees. Each aspect carried its own significance, with trines and sextiles generally considered harmonious and favorable. Squares and oppositions, tense and challenging, and conjunctions variable depending on which planets were involved. The orbs of aspect, the range within which an aspect was considered effective, were carefully defined in medieval astrological texts. Larger, brighter bodies like the sun and moon cast wider orbs. Their influence felt at greater distances, while smaller planets had narrower ranges. An aspect that was applying, meaning the faster planet was moving toward exact aspect with the slower, was generally considered more powerful than one that was separating, where the aspect had already perfected and the planets were moving apart. The direction of application, whether a planet approached aspect through direct or retrograde motion, added further nuance to the interpretation. These technical foundations supported a variety of interpretive applications depending on the type of question being addressed. Natal astrology, the interpretation of birth charts, was perhaps the most elaborate branch of the art. The natal chart was believed to contain in potential everything that would unfold in the native's life, and the astrologer's task was to read this potential and explain how and when it would manifest. The ascendant and its ruler described the native's body, temperament, and general approach to life. The sun represented vitality, honor, and the father. The moon governed the emotions, the body's moisture, and the mother. Each house of the chart corresponded to a specific life domain, from self and possessions through siblings, parents, children, health, marriage, death, religion, career, friends, and hidden enemies. The technique of annual revolutions allowed the astrologer to examine how the general promises of the nativity would unfold year by year. Each year, when the sun returned to its exact natal position, a new solar return chart was cast and analyzed in conjunction with the birth chart. Its condition of the planets in the revolution, particularly the ruler of the ascendant, indicated the general tenor of the year ahead. Good aspects from benefics promised favorable developments, while afflictions from malefics warned of difficulties and dangers. The solar return was typically examined alongside other predictive techniques to build a comprehensive picture of what the coming year would bring. Profections offered another method for timing events in the nativity. This technique assigned each house of the birth chart to successive years of life, so that the first year was ruled by the first house, the second year by the second house, and so on through the 12 houses, then repeating the cycle. The planet ruling the sign on the perfected house became the Lord of the year. In its condition in both the nativity and the solar return received special attention. If the Lord of the year was well placed and well spected, the year would tend toward good fortune in the matters associated with that planet. If it was afflicted or poorly placed, corresponding difficulties could be expected. Primary directions constituted the most mathematically complex of the timing techniques, requiring sophisticated calculations to determine when significant points in the birth chart would be brought into aspect with each other. Through the daily rotation of the celestial sphere, unlike transits, which tracked the actual current positions of planets, directions were symbolic movements based on the rate of approximately 1 degree per year of life. When a directed planet or point reached aspect with a natal planet or sensitive point, events corresponding to the natures of the bodies involved were expected to manifest. The calculation of primary directions required mastery of spherical trigonometry and was considered one of the hallmarks of advanced astrological skill. Interrogational astrology, or horary, took a different approach, casting charts not for births, but for the moment a question was asked and understood by the astrologer. This branch of the art assumed that the heavens, at the moment of the question, reflected the situation being asked about and contained indications of its resolution. The querent, the person asking, was signified by the first house and its ruler. The quaesitive, the matter being asked about, is assigned to the appropriate house based on its nature, relationships to the seventh, money to the second, siblings to the third, and so on. Its condition of these significators and the aspects forming between them revealed whether the desired outcome would be achieved. Elections, the choice of favorable times for beginning actions, required the astrologer to work in the opposite direction from interrogations and nativities, rather than interpreting a chart already determined by circumstances. The electoral astrologer sought to find a future moment when celestial configurations would favor the intended action. This required balancing multiple factors, strengthening the significators of the matter at hand, placing benefics in favorable houses, avoiding malefic afflictions, and ensuring that applying aspects promised successful completion. Perfect elections were rarely possible given the constraints of the actual sky, and the electoral astrologer's skill lay in finding acceptable compromises that maximized advantages while minimizing risks. These techniques, transmitted from Arabic sources and elaborated by European practitioners, formed the working toolkit of the medieval astrologer. Mastering them required years of study and practice, combining mathematical precision with interpretive judgment. The astrologer had to calculate accurately, interpret wisely, and communicate effectively, translating the abstract language of celestial configurations into meaningful guidance for clients facing real decisions and real uncertainties. It was this combination of technical rigor and practical application that gave medieval astrology its power and prestige, making it not merely an intellectual curiosity, but a living practice that touched the lives of people at every level of society. The year 1348 brought a darkness upon Europe such as no living person had ever witnessed. Catastrophe so vast and so terrible that those who survived it struggled to find words adequate to describe what they had endured. The pestilence came from the east, carried along the trade routes that connected Europe to the wider world, and wherever it touched, death followed with appalling swiftness. Entire families were extinguished in days. Villages were emptied of their inhabitants. Cities that had teemed with life became vast charnel houses, the dead too numerous to bury, the living too few and too terrified to perform the offices of the deceased. By the time the first wave of plague had passed, perhaps 1/3 of Europe's population had perished. A demographic catastrophe unmatched before or since in recorded history. In the face of such overwhelming horror, people desperately sought explanations. Why had this calamity befallen them? What had they done to deserve such punishment? What cosmic forces had been unleashed to bring about such universal suffering? The Church offered one answer, proclaiming the plague as divine judgment upon a sinful world, calling for repentance and prayer as the only remedies for celestial wrath. But alongside this theological interpretation, another explanation emerged, one rooted not in divine anger, but in the natural philosophy of the celestial spheres. The astrologers stepped forward to offer their analysis, and their voices were heard at the highest levels of authority. King Philip VI of France commissioned the medical faculty of the University of Paris to investigate the causes of the pestilence and to recommend measures for its prevention. The Paris masters were among the most learned men in Christendom, trained in the Aristotelian natural philosophy that had come to dominate university curricula, and they approached their task with the tools their education had provided. Their report, completed within weeks and quickly disseminated throughout Europe, would become the most influential medical document of the plague years, copied, translated, and cited for generations as the authoritative explanation of the Black Death's origins. The Paris masters identified the primary cause of the pestilence as celestial, a conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars that had occurred on March 20th, 1345, in the sign of Aquarius. This was no ordinary conjunction, but a meeting of the three superior planets, an event of the greatest astrological significance that occurred only rarely across the centuries. Saturn, cold and malefic, brought corruption and death. Mars, hot and violent, inflamed and excited the pestilential influences. Jupiter, though normally benefic, in this configuration served to spread and amplify the effects of his malevolent companions. The conjunction had occurred in a human sign, Aquarius, indicating that humanity would be the particular target of its influence, and in the first phase of that sign, a segment associated with death and disaster. The mechanism by which this celestial configuration produced plague on Earth followed the principles of natural philosophy. The conjunction had corrupted the air, drawing up vapors from the earth and the seas, mixing them with noxious influences from the celestial spheres, and spreading this poisoned atmosphere across the world. Those who breathed this corrupted air found their humoral balance disrupted, their bodies predisposed to the rapid putrefaction that characterized the plague. The specific symptoms of the disease, the buboes that swelled in groin and armpit, the blackening of the skin, the rapid progression from health to death, all could be explained by the particular combination of planetary influences at work. The Paris report did not rely solely on the Great Conjunction of 1345. It also noted the occurrence of eclipses and other celestial phenomena that had preceded and accompanied the plague's outbreak. Eclipses were traditionally regarded as ominous signs, interruptions in the normal order of the heavens that portended disruption and disaster on Earth. Solar eclipses were particularly significant, as the sun was the source of life and vitality, and its temporary obscuration suggested a withdrawal of vital force from the world. The masters traced a pattern of eclipses and conjunctions that, taken together, explained both the occurrence of the plague and its unprecedented severity. The astrological explanation offered by the Paris faculty was not mere superstition, but represented the best medical science of its time, grounded in the same philosophical principles that underlay all learned medicine. The connection between celestial events and epidemic disease had been recognized since antiquity, elaborated by Arabic physicians, and taught in the great medical schools of Europe. When faced with a disease of unknown origin and terrifying virulence, it was entirely natural for educated physicians to look to the heavens for explanation. The stars provided a causal framework that made sense of what otherwise seemed senseless, a pattern of cosmic meaning that offered some comfort in the midst of incomprehensible suffering. The reception of the Paris report was widespread and largely accepting. Copies circulated throughout Europe, translated from Latin into vernacular languages, summarized in shorter treatises, and incorporated into the plague literature that proliferated in the following years. Other physicians offered their own astrological analyses, sometimes differing in details, but generally agreeing that celestial causes lay behind the pestilence. The Great Conjunction of 1345 became the standard explanation for the Black Death's origin, cited in texts produced across Europe for decades after the initial outbreak. When subsequent waves of plague struck, as they did repeatedly throughout the 14th and 15th centuries, astrologers examined the heavens for conjunctions and eclipses that might explain each new visitation. The plague years reinforced and intensified European engagement with astrology in multiple ways. The experience of catastrophe on such a scale naturally turned minds toward cosmic explanations, and astrology provided a framework for understanding events that seemed to transcend ordinary human causation. If the stars could bring plague, what else might they portend? The fear and uncertainty generated by the Black Death made people eager for any knowledge that might help them anticipate and prepare for future disasters. Astrologers who could predict when celestial configurations might again turn dangerous provided a service that many were willing to pay for. The decades following the Black Death saw a proliferation of astrological prognostications, annual predictions that examined the celestial configurations of the coming year and forecast what they might bring. These prognostications typically analyzed the major conjunctions, eclipses, and planetary ingresses expected in the year ahead, interpreting their significance for weather, agriculture, health, and political affairs. The advent of printing in the 15th century would make such annual predictions even more widespread. But the genre was already well established in the manuscript culture of the 14th century. Plague had demonstrated that the heavens could bring death on a vast scale, and prudent people wanted advance warning of any similar threats. Comets added another dimension to the celestial interpretation of disaster. Medieval people regarded comets as exceptional and ominous phenomena, their sudden appearance disrupting the orderly movement of the heavens and portending disruption on Earth. When comets appeared in the skies over plague-stricken Europe, they were naturally incorporated into the astrological explanation of events. The comet was seen not as a cause of plague in itself, but as a sign, a celestial announcement that catastrophe was at hand. Chronicles of the plague years frequently mention comets among the prodigies that accompanied the pestilence, linking heaven and earth in a web of significant correspondence. The psychological impact of the plague on astrological belief is difficult to overstate. Those who lived through the Black Death inhabited a world that had demonstrated its capacity for sudden, overwhelming destruction. The old certainties had been shattered, the social order disrupted, the economy transformed. In such circumstances, the desire to understand and predict celestial influences was not merely intellectual curiosity, but existential necessity. If the stars had brought one catastrophe, they might bring another. And only through careful attention to celestial signs could the wise hope to prepare. This heightened awareness of cosmic vulnerability persisted for generations, shaping the culture of the late medieval period. The conjunction theory that explained the Black Death was part of a larger framework of mundane astrology that sought to understand history itself as a product of celestial cycles. The great conjunctions of Saturn and Jupiter, occurring approximately every 20 years, were believed to mark significant transitions in human affairs, and these conjunctions shifted from signs of one element to signs of another. It's a process that occurred roughly every 200 years. Even more dramatic changes were expected. The Arabic astrologers, particularly Abu Mashar, had developed elaborate schemes correlating these celestial cycles with the rise and fall of religions, dynasties, and civilizations. Medieval European astrologers inherited these schemes and applied them to their own historical circumstances. The approach of significant conjunctions generated both anticipation and anxiety. Astrologers calculated when the next great conjunction would occur and speculated about what changes it might bring. Would it mark the fall of kingdoms, the rise of new powers, the advent of a new religious dispensation? These speculations could take on apocalyptic dimensions, particularly as the theory of conjunctions merged with Christian expectations of the end times. Some astrologers suggested that celestial cycles pointed toward the coming of Antichrist or the final judgment, readings that the church officially discouraged, but that found receptive audiences among populations traumatized by plague and war. The experience of the 14th century, with its plagues, famines, wars, and schisms, seemed to confirm that the world had entered an age of unprecedented tribulation. Astrological analysis provided a framework for understanding this tribulation as part of a cosmic pattern. Not random suffering, but meaningful transition orchestrated by the movements of the celestial spheres. This was cold comfort perhaps, but comfort nonetheless. For it suggested that the suffering had purpose and that it would eventually give way to whatever new order the stars had ordained. The alternative, that catastrophe was meaningless, that death came without reason and departed without explanation, was psychologically unbearable. The intersection of plague and astrology also had practical medical dimensions beyond the identification of causes. Physicians used astrological principles to guide their responses to epidemic disease, choosing times for prophylactic measures, bloodletting, and the administration of medicines based on celestial configurations. The theory held that treatments were more effective when performed under favorable stars. And plague treatises routinely included astrological advice alongside recommendations for diet, hygiene, and medication. Whether such astrological timing actually improved outcomes is doubtful, but it provided a sense of control and systematic response in circumstances that otherwise seemed to offer no defense. As the 14th century gave way to the 15th, the memory of the Black Death remained vivid, and astrology retained its role as the primary framework for understanding epidemic disease. Subsequent plague outbreaks were analyzed using the same techniques the Paris masters had employed, with astrologers examining conjunctions, eclipses, and other celestial phenomena for indications of pestilential influence. The association between celestial events and plague became so firmly established that it would persist well into the early modern period, surviving even the Copernican revolution that transformed European understanding of the cosmos. Only gradually, over centuries, would new models of disease causation replace the astrological framework. And even then, traces of the old association would linger in popular consciousness. The Black Death and its astrological interpretation stand as one of the most striking examples of how medieval people used celestial science to make sense of their world. Faced with a catastrophe beyond comprehension, they turned to the stars for explanation and found there a pattern of meaning that connected their suffering to the grand movements of the cosmos. Whether this explanation was true in any objective sense mattered less than its function, providing a framework for understanding, a basis for prediction, and a source of whatever comfort could be found in the darkest of times. The stars that had seemed to ordain such devastation also promised that devastation was not eternal, that celestial cycles would turn, and that the same cosmic order that brought plague would eventually bring restoration. The 15th century dawned upon a Europe transformed by the catastrophes of the previous 100 years. Yet the celestial science that had helped people make sense of those catastrophes remained firmly trenched in the intellectual and cultural life of the age. Astrology has survived the Black Death, the 100 Years' War, the Great Schism, and countless lesser calamities, emerging from each crisis with its prestige enhanced rather than diminished. The stars had explained what had happened and promised insight into what was yet to come. As Europe began to slow recovery from its 14th century traumas, astrology would reach new heights of influence and sophistication before encountering challenges that would ultimately transform it beyond recognition. The invention of the printing press in the middle of the 15th century revolutionized the dissemination of astrological knowledge. Before Gutenberg, astrological texts had circulated in expensive manuscript copies, accessible only to the wealthy, the institutional, and the fortunate few who could gain access to libraries or secured the patronage of the powerful. Printing changed everything. Suddenly, astrological treatises could be produced in hundreds or thousands of copies. Their prices fall into levels that put them within reach of merchants, professionals, and even prosperous artisans. The annual prognostication, that genre of yearly prediction based on celestial configurations, became one of the first mass-produced forms of literature, printed in huge quantities and sold at fairs and markets across Europe. Its democratization of astrological knowledge had profound consequences for the practice and perception of a celestial art. Where once astrology had been the preserve of learned scholars in privileged courts, it now became accessible to a much broader public. Almanacs containing basic astrological information, including favorable days for planting, harvesting, bloodletting, and other activities, became household items in literate homes across Europe. Simplified guides to natal astrology allowed curious readers to attempt interpretation of their own birth charts. The mysteries of the celestial science. Once guarded by Latin learning and mathematical complexity, were translated into vernacular languages and presented in forms that ordinary people could understand and apply. This popularization brought its own tensions. Learned astrologers, proud of their sophisticated techniques and philosophical training, sometimes looked askance at the simplified versions of their art that now circulated among the masses. The annual prognosticators, producing their sensationalist predictions of wars, plagues, and disasters, seemed to many serious practitioners to be bringing the art into disrepute. Yet, the popular appetite for astrological guidance proved insatiable, and the market rewarded those who could provide it in accessible forms. The tension between elite and popular astrology, between learned sophistication and vulgar simplification, would persist throughout the early modern period and beyond. The Renaissance brought new intellectual currents that both supported and challenged traditional astrology. The humanist movement, with its emphasis on returning to classical sources, encouraged fresh engagement with the astrological texts of antiquity, particularly the works of Ptolemy that had always been regarded as foundational. Humanist scholars produced new translations of these texts, seeking to recover their original meaning from the accretions and distortions of medieval transmission. This philological enterprise sometimes led to revisions in astrological doctrine, as humanists discovered that medieval interpretations did not always accord with what the ancient authorities had actually written. At the same time, the Renaissance recovery of other ancient texts exposed European intellectuals to classical critiques of astrology that had been largely forgotten during the medieval period. The arguments of ancient skeptics, who had questioned whether celestial influence could really determine human affairs, became available to readers who might previously have encountered only the pro-astrological tradition. Cicero's dismissal of Chaldean star reading, the objections raised by the skeptical philosophers, the mockery of astrologers by ancient satirists, all these now circulated alongside the more familiar texts of Ptolemy and his successors. The intellectual consensus that had supported medieval astrology began to show cracks. The most formidable intellectual assault on astrology came from an unexpected quarter: the brilliant young philosopher Giovanni Pico della Mirandola. Pico was no narrow specialist, but a prodigy of Renaissance learning who sought to synthesize all branches of knowledge into a unified vision of cosmic truth. He had studied astrology deeply and initially accepted its claims, but in the last years of his short life, he turned against the celestial art with devastating force. His disputations against divinatory astrology, published posthumously in 1496, mounted a comprehensive attack on astrological principles and practice, marshaling philosophical, theological, and empirical arguments against the claims of the star readers. Pico's critique was remarkable for its thoroughness and its sophistication. He did not merely repeat the old theological objections about fate and free will, though he gave these their due. He attacked the foundations of astrological theory itself, questioning whether the zodiacal signs had any real existence, whether the planets truly possessed the natures attributed to them, whether the house divisions had any rational basis. He pointed to the disagreements among astrologers themselves. The different systems and conflicting rules that practitioners could not reconcile. He noted the failures of astrological prediction, the confident forecasts that events had contradicted. He challenged his readers to consider whether astrology really worked or whether its apparent successes were merely the product of vague language and selective memory. The impact of Pico's attack was substantial, though not immediately fatal to astrology. His work was widely read and frequently cited by subsequent critics of the celestial art. It emboldened those who had harbored private doubts to speak out publicly. It provided a repertoire of arguments that could be deployed against astrologers in debate. Yet, astrology was too deeply embedded in European culture to be overthrown by a single book, however brilliant. Defenders of the art responded to Pico's arguments, pointing out weaknesses in his reasoning and errors in his understanding of astrological doctrine. The debate that Pico had intensified would continue for another 2 centuries, with neither side achieving decisive victory. The religious transformations of the 16th century added new dimensions to the controversy over astrology. Protestant reformers, seeking to purify Christianity of what they saw as medieval corruptions, sometimes targeted astrology as one of the superstitious accretions that needed to be stripped away. Martin Luther expressed skepticism about astrological prediction while acknowledging that celestial bodies might have some natural influence on earthly events. John Calvin condemned astrology more thoroughly, seeing in it a denial of divine providence and an invitation to idolatry. Yet, Protestant attitudes were not uniformly hostile, and many Lutherans, in particular, continued to practice and defend astrology throughout the Reformation era. Catholic responses were similarly varied. The Council of Trent, which defined Catholic doctrine against Protestant challenges, did not issue any definitive pronouncement on astrology, leaving the question in the same ambiguous state it had occupied throughout the medieval period. Individual Catholic authorities ranged from enthusiastic practitioners to fierce critics. The traditional Thomistic position, accepting natural celestial influence while rejecting deterministic judicial astrology, remaining the nominal standard without being consistently enforced. Papal courts continued to employ astrologers, even as papal bulls periodically condemned superstitious practices that might include certain astrological applications. The transformation that would ultimately displace astrology from its central position in European thought was not primarily religious or philosophical, but cosmological. The Copernican revolution, which removed the Earth from the center of the universe and set it in motion around the sun, struck at the very foundations of the astrological worldview. Medieval astrology was premised on a geocentric cosmos in which the Earth stood still at the center, while the celestial spheres rotated around it, raining down their influences upon the sublunary realm. If the Earth was merely one planet among others, orbiting the sun like its neighbors, what became of the special relationship between heaven and earth that astrology assumed? The full implications of Copernicanism took time to work out, and astrology proved surprisingly resilient in the face of the new astronomy. Many early Copernicans, including Copernicus himself, continued to believe in celestial influence and to practice astrology. The great astronomer Tycho Brahe's observations will provide the data for Kepler's laws of planetary motion, was also a practicing astrologer who cast horoscopes for the Danish royal family. Even Johannes Kepler, one of the founders of modern astronomy, practiced astrology throughout his career, though he sought to reform it along lines he considered more rational. The disentanglement of astronomy from astrology was gradual rather than sudden, a process that extended well into the 17th century. Yet, gradually, the disentanglement did occur. The mechanical philosophy that emerged in the 17th century, with its vision of nature as a vast machine operating according to mathematical laws, had no place for the qualitative influences and symbolic correspondences that astrology required. Celestial bodies were merely masses moving through space according to the laws of gravity. How could they impart the specific qualities of warmth and coldness, beneficence and malevolence that astrological theory attributed to them? The new science offered its own form of cosmic wonder, revealing a universe vaster and more intricate than anything the ancients had imagined. But it was a wonder that did not include meaningful communication between the heavens and human affairs. The legacy of medieval astrology did not disappear entirely with the scientific revolution. Popular almanacs and astrological predictions continued to circulate, and astrology retained adherents among those who remained unconvinced by the new philosophy, or who found in the old celestial science something that the new one could not provide. The 20th and 21st centuries would see revivals of interest in astrology, though in forms quite different from medieval practice. Modern astrology, with its emphasis on psychological insight and personal growth, bears only distant resemblance to the mathematically rigorous and philosophically grounded celestial science of the medieval universities. What endures from the medieval astrological tradition is perhaps less its specific doctrines than its underlying impulse. The human desire to find meaning in the cosmos, to believe that our lives unfold according to patterns larger than ourselves, to feel that we are connected to something vast and eternal. But medieval astrologers, for all their errors about the nature of the physical universe, grasped something true about the human condition. We are creatures who need to believe that our existence matters, that our sufferings have purpose, that the universe is not indifferent to our fate. Medieval astrology provided a language for expressing this need and a framework for satisfying it, connecting the individual soul to the great dance of the celestial spheres. As you drift toward sleep beneath the same stars that medieval astrologers studied with such devoted attention, you might reflect on this long history of humanity's engagement with the heavens. The constellations that wheel overhead tonight are the same patterns that Ptolemy catalogued, that Arabic scholars named, that medieval physicians consulted before treating their patients. The planets that wander among those fixed stars are the same wanderers whose conjunctions once seemed to herald plagues in the fall of empires. The cosmos is different now, vastly larger and stranger than anyone in the medieval world could have imagined. Yet our place within it still raises the same ancient questions. What does it mean to be a small creature on a small planet in an inconceivably vast universe? How do we find meaning and purpose in the face of our cosmic insignificance? Medieval astrology offered one set of answers to these questions, answers that no longer satisfied the standards of modern science, but that served their age with remarkable effectiveness for nearly 1,000 years. From the translation movements of the early medieval period to the dawn of the scientific revolution, astrology provided Europeans with a coherent worldview that connected human affairs to cosmic order, that explained suffering and promised insight into the future, that gave meaning to lives lived in the shadow of death and uncertainty. Its decline marked not just a change in scientific theory, but a transformation in humanity's sense of its place in the universe. A transformation whose consequences we are still working out today. The stars still shine as they shone over Baghdad when Mashallah cast horoscopes for caliphs, as they shone over Toledo when Gerard of Cremona translated the secrets of Arabic learning, as they shone over Paris when the university masters sought celestial explanations for the Black Death. They will shine long after we too have passed, indifferent perhaps to human affairs, yet beautiful still capable of inspiring wonder and contemplation in those who turn their eyes upward. In that wonder, if nowhere else, we remain connected to the medieval astrologers who believed they could read in those distant lights the one destiny of souls and the fate of nations. Their science was wrong, but their wonder was real, and in wonder, at least, we could still share.